I have something for you.
What are you doing?
Nobody talks to Corrado Malacarne like that, least of all a waitress, and certainly not in Sicilian. He'd been sure she was just some Roman girl with pretty skin and a deaf ear, until his filthy pickup line came flying back in his face. Translated, razor sharp, in thick dialect. "You're an idiot, but you're lucky you're so damn hot." He smiled, felt the world close in. Say it again, this time looking at me. And over the weeks that follow, Serafina is going to learn that there are two things worse than an obsessed mafia boss. A mafia boss who's been betrayed, and a mafia boss who has just discovered her secret. Hi, I'm Lena. A special shout out to those of you watching Book 1 for free here on the My Stories platform, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Chapter 1, The Wrong Pickup Line. The plastic curtain slapped against my back as I shoved open the back door of Pesca del Santo, the one no outsider suspected existed behind the chilled display cases of the fish shop. The hallway was narrow, the light was yellow, and the heat from the dining room hit me the moment I crossed through the cold room. The Cortile Rosso was packed for a midweek night. The cracked red tiles gleamed under the low-hanging fixtures, and the wood of the tables grew darker with every year I'd worked there. 3 years without missing a single shift. 3 years of head down, tray up, and ears pretending to be deaf. I ducked into the locker room, a windowless cubicle next to the pantry, and checked on the jar of ginger cookies hidden in my backpack. The owner thought they were for low blood pressure. Juicy, my co-worker on the other side of the floor, thought they were some retired nurse habit. They were both wrong. The cookies were for the nausea that came up without warning, for the heartburn mid-shift, for the moment the smell of fish pushed through the wall, and I had to pretend I was fine. I pressed my palm to my belly for a second. The locker room door leaned shut. 10 weeks I'd been carrying with me into that bar every single night. I still remembered the morning I saw the second line on the test. I was sitting on the bathroom floor, a towel around my shoulders and my hair dripping, and on the other side of that news there was no one. The person who should have been there wasn't, couldn't be, and I was slowly coming to understand that this child was going to grow up with me and only me, without a father to share the shock. The apron tied around my waist without cinching. I'd bought it 2 sizes too big on purpose. I stepped out of the locker room and slid into my shift. The first hour was easy. Shots of grappa, an aperitivo, 2 customers arguing about soccer. Juicy was working the opposite side, and the back table, the one neither of us would take without being called, was still empty. It was after midnight that the Cortile Rosso changed temperature. 4 men came in together through the plastic curtain, in no rush. I recognized 2 of them, Ruggiero, the city capo, and Nardo, who ran the port at Ostia. The third was a shadow leaning against the wall, arms crossed, eyes everywhere at once. The fourth pulled out the chair at the head of the back table and sat down with the calm of a man who already knew the chair was his. I didn't need the name. The ring on his pinky introduced him on its own. Matte gold, a blade crossed over an olive branch. Corrado Malacarne. I'd served his table 6 times in the past few months, always from a distance, always without him looking at me. This was the first time he'd come in after midnight. Juicy nudged my shoulder near the counter. "That table's yours tonight." "Why?" "Because the Don asked for the waitress from the corner." She shrugged and went to take care of a couple at the door. By the time I got to the table, the 4 of them had lowered their voices, and the first sign that tonight was going to be different came from there. From the language. They'd switched. Deep Sicilian, Old Palermo, the dialect my grandmother used to speak with me at home in Catania. Nonna taught me to cook, to pray, and to listen, and the first rule was that whoever understands doesn't interrupt. I grew up listening to the men in the neighborhood, and not one of them knew I caught every word. Inside the Cortile Rosso, it was the same thing. 3 years of mi scusi signore in neutral Italian. They thought I was Roman. I let them think it, because the pay was good, and the silence was my end of the deal. I started setting out the glasses. Ruggiero ordered grappa. Nardo ordered water and whiskey. The shadow raised his hand and waved it off. I'd only find out later that his name was Cillian, but that night, he was just the man who seemed to watch everything at once. Corrado hadn't ordered anything yet. As I leaned in to set Nardo's glass down, Ruggiero said something to Nardo, in dialect, about my waist, something about the size, about the color of my skin above the apron. I gripped the glass harder than I needed to and kept pouring, because Nonna had also taught me that anger served hot is anger wasted. That was when Corrado looked at me for the first time. His eyes were a brown that bordered on black, and the scar at the corner of his lip surfaced as he started to smile. There was no amusement in the smile. There was calculation, the patience of a man who had already decided on his next line and was only choosing when to land it. He landed it. In Sicilian. Slowly. I'd eat that girl whole, right down to the bone. Ruggiero laughed under his breath. Nardo let out a short whistle through his teeth. The shadow against the wall didn't move a muscle. I finished setting the glass down. My hand didn't shake, which, looking back, still surprises me. I wiped my fingers on the end of the cloth tucked into my apron and lifted my face for the first time that night. His eyes were already waiting for mine. The certainty at his mouth was still the same. I took one breath, calmly, because Nonna always said a sharp Sicilian is answered in Sicilian with a point, and never, under any circumstances, in a hurry. You're an idiot, but you're lucky you're so damn hot. The whole table locked up. Ruggiero stopped laughing mid-breath. Nardo turned his head with the speed of a man who'd just heard a gunshot on another street. Cillian, the shadow, cracked the first smile of his night. Small, closed-mouthed, almost invisible, but it was there, and Corrado, across the table, stared at me with his jaw locked and his lips still parted on the last syllable of a joke that hadn't ended the way he'd meant it to. I straightened up. I lowered the tray. I was already calculating my route back to the counter when the chair scraped. He rose slowly. He took up space in a way that made the whole room feel smaller, and I, who am not a woman who backs down, took half a step back before I caught myself. His hand found my arm without squeezing, just closed around my wrist over the fabric of my sleeve. His thumb brushed my skin, and I felt the heavy metal of the ring graze the inside of my wrist. He lowered his face to mine, close enough for me to catch the smell of expensive whiskey he hadn't ordered there yet, but which he already carried on his shirt, close enough for me to realize that his voice, when he wanted it to, could drop lower than a whisper. "Say it again," he said, in Italian this time, clean, without a trace of dialect. This time, looking at me. I looked, and I ran, not the dignified way. I spun sideways, shoved the tray toward the counter in a motion juicy snatched out of the air before the dishes could crash, and cut across the floor with the cloth still knotted into my apron. The kitchen door slammed behind me. The smell of frying oil hit me and my stomach threatened to rise. I pressed my chin against the hand still dirty from the cloth and pushed down the hallway to the locker room. My backpack was on the hook. I yanked it hard and tore the side strap. I didn't care. I shoved open the back door, the one that opened onto the service alley, and the Trastevere night met me with a cold wind that stung my hot face. I ran. 3 blocks. I vaulted the low railing of a closed piazza, cut through the alley by the abandoned market, and only stopped when my legs refused the next step. I leaned my shoulder against a peeling wall, my free hand over my belly on top of the coat, and tried to remember the name of the street I was on. A taxi appeared at the corner without my waving one down. I raised my arm. It stopped. I climbed into the back seat, and when the driver asked where to, I opened my mouth 3 times before I could manage to say the name of my neighborhood. Testaccio, I answered, the word coming out chopped, as if I'd forgotten my own language. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window. My hand stayed on my belly, steady, and I only realized I was shaking when the driver looked at me in the rearview mirror and asked if I wanted him to call someone. No, I answered. Just take me home. Home was the 3rd-floor walk-up of a building with cracked tilework. Miriam, my friend and roommate, was awake, because Miriam is always the last one to turn off the kitchen light. She heard the door before I could even pull the key out of the lock. I barely had time to drop my backpack on the floor. I ran to the bathroom, dropped to my knees in front of the toilet, and threw up for the 2nd time that same day. Miriam appeared in the doorway with her mug of black coffee and salt in her hand, her hair pinned up in a bun that had already started to fall apart. "Serafina," she said, my name split down the middle by worry. "Did the guy from the bar hit you?" I raised my face. Bitter mouth, sweaty forehead, my hand still on my belly on reflex. Miriam was looking at me with the seriousness she kept hidden behind a smile she only used when she wanted me to calm down. I took a deep breath. I tried to laugh. It didn't come. "Worse," I answered. "He saw." Miriam lowered the mug. Her smile vanished, and I closed my eyes, because if I kept them open, I was going to have to explain which of the 2 saws was the one making me shake. The Sicilian I'd thrown in the face of the most dangerous man in Rome, or the look he'd answered it with, the look of a man who has no intention of letting it pass. Chapter 2. Ridiculous Escapes. I missed 2 shifts in a row. The first night I faked a migraine over the phone, the second the flu. Midway through the afternoon of the 3rd day, while she was going over the month's budget notebook, Miriam stared at me over her mug and said I had to go back. Rent was due at the end of the week. The prenatal appointment was due at the start of the next. There was no choice. I came in through the cold room at the usual hour. At the counter, Juicy looked at me and smiled with her mouth shut. There at the usual table, Corrado was at the back table, but this time he'd moved to the side, facing the kitchen door. The table was full. The man with crossed arms from last time, Sicilian, as Juicy told me that night, an Irishman raised in Palermo, was in his usual corner. Next to Corrado, a fine wool scarf tucked inside his suit jacket, sat Ettore Brancaleone, consigliere to the Don's father, a Palermo veteran, a man who spoke little, and when he did, killed. I served the table. Corrado didn't call me by name. He ordered a whiskey and went back to the conversation. I stepped away. I breathed. I worked the next hour on the opposite side of the floor. It was all going to work, until he noticed what I didn't want him to notice. Halfway through my shift, I forced a bad step on my right foot and doubled over with invented pain. A sprain. I whispered to Juicy that she'd take the back table for a few minutes, and I limped down the hallway to the restrooms. When I opened my eyes, he was there, standing at the mouth of the hallway, shoulder against the wall, 2 strides away. "Which foot?" he asked. I lifted the left one. Reflex. Bad instinct. Wrong. The sprained foot was the right one. His eyes dropped to the wrong foot, rose again, stopped on mine. "Last time," he said, his voice lower. "You ran out on that foot." I didn't answer. He stepped half a step closer. His hand came up to the height of my shoulder, stopped in the air, and dropped back without finishing the motion. "I'm not here to push you," he said. "I'm here to let you know that Juicy isn't working our table tonight, because I asked for you. I don't need to be asked for." The scar at the corner of his lip twitched into something close to a smile without quite getting there. "You'd rather be dismissed?" He stepped back with a calm motion, turned his shoulder, and walked away. He stopped in the middle of the hallway without turning his head. "I'll wait for you to pour the next bottle, in your own time." I poured it. He didn't call me again. He drank slowly, talked with Ettore, and left without paying the check, because men like him never pay in front of others. In the locker room, the bar owner knocked on the door and handed me a stiff card, bone-colored, folded once, black, firm handwriting, the gold crest in the bottom corner. "The waitress from the corner. Do not reassign her." The weekend came before I could process any of it. Miriam knocked on my bedroom door with the market list, and I went down with her to the Mercato di Testaccio. It was at the fig stand that I decided to tell her. "Miriam, he sent me a note." "Who?" "The boss." Miriam stopped squeezing the figs. She looked at me. She looked at the figs. She looked at me again. A vendor shouted the price of oranges 3 stalls down, and neither of us heard him. "The boss, boss. The boss, boss. Hold on. I need coffee for this." She snagged an espresso at the stand next door, threw it back in one go, and came back, kicking the shopping bag off to the side with her foot. "Tell me everything." I told it in pieces, with my back to the market traffic, my voice low enough to not become gossip for the neighbor at the cheese stall. The look, the hallway, the hand that almost touched, and didn't, the note. Miriam listened all the way through, grabbed a fig, bit off half, and said, chewing, "I've got 3 solutions. The first, you move into the convent with the poor Clares. 3 meals a day, mandatory silence. No obsessed Sicilian is going to agree to kidnap a nun." I laughed. Short, but I laughed. "The second is to pretend you're already married. Fake wedding ring from the Chinese guy's shop on the corner. The third is the best. You pretend you only speak Russian. If he talks Sicilian, you shrug. If he talks Italian, you shrug. If he talks Russian, you shrug too, because his Russian is going to be terrible." I laughed for real. A laugh that started in my belly and climbed up, and that reminded me of the days when I used to laugh for simple reasons. And the laugh died. I rested my hand on the other side of my dress, right on top of the spot where my belly was starting to hint at what was still a secret, and my whole body reminded me why the laughter couldn't last. Miriam saw it. She wiped her hands on her own dress and looked at me without any of the joking. "Serafina, you're 10 weeks in. Sooner or later that apron is going to stop covering." I didn't answer. I took the bag from her hand and kept walking, because walking was still easier than talking about what I was about to stop being able to hide. It was at the corner of my building that I stopped. A black car parked against the curb, tinted windows, thick doors, armored, not a model from the neighborhood. "Do you know that car?" Miriam asked. "No." We crossed the last few meters without talking. I opened the door of the building, and before stepping in, on impulse I turned my head. The car was still there. No window rolled down. Nobody got out. When the living room light came on and Miriam pulled the curtain, I heard the engine below. The car drove off, and I pressed my forehead against the refrigerator door because I needed something cold against my face to remind me that the world outside still existed. Chapter 3: The Hallway. A few days went by before I saw Corrado again. I worked 2 nights with the back table empty. The note in the owner's pocket was still in effect. He told me, without much ceremony, that as long as that card existed, I was the waitress for that table. End of story. But the table sat empty, and I worked with the faked calm of someone who breathes easier when the danger isn't in the room. On the 3rd night, he came back. I was collecting glasses at the counter when I felt the temperature of the floor shift. I didn't look at the door. I didn't have to. Juicy passed behind me and brushed my elbow with her fingers for a second, just long enough to confirm what my skin had already registered. Corrado sat in the same sideways position as last time, facing the kitchen door, back to the wall, a sightline that let nothing slip by. Sicilian was in his usual corner, on his feet, arms loose at his sides this time, which struck me as worse than crossed, because loose hands are hands that are free. The other 2 were faces I didn't know, and Ettore wasn't there. I served the table. Corrado didn't call me by name. He didn't look at me any longer than he had to. He ordered a whiskey, and went back to talking with the man on his left. Sicilian turned down a drink with the same short gesture as always. I stepped away. I breathed. I worked the whole next hour on the opposite side of the floor, serving tables that asked for nothing beyond wine and manners. It was all going to work. I was going to survive the night without crossing the invisible line I'd drawn for myself between the counter and that back table, until my body decided for me. The nausea came without warning, not the light kind that I managed with ginger and breathing. This was the other one, the heavy kind, the one that climbs up from the stomach and shoves against the throat. I dropped the tray on the counter with a noise Juicy heard from the other side, and I didn't wait for a signal or permission. I walked fast toward the restroom hallway, the only exit possible, because throwing up behind the counter in front of 40 customers was not an option my pride was willing to accept. The hallway was narrow, poorly lit, with a single yellowish bulb on the ceiling that flickered every 20 seconds. I passed the door of the ladies' room, which was locked from inside, and I leaned against the opposite wall, hand over my mouth, counting the seconds for the nausea to pass. When I opened my eyes, he was at the mouth of the hallway. I didn't see him get up. I didn't hear the footsteps. Corrado was standing in the entrance with his left shoulder against the doorframe, legs crossed at the ankle, head slightly tilted to one side, watching me with the unbearable calm of a man who'd gotten there before I'd even noticed he'd left the table. The nausea receded. I don't know if it was relief or startle. "You speak my language better than plenty of people in my own house," he said, in Italian this time, his voice low and unhurried. "And still you run." I took my hand off my mouth. I straightened my spine. The wall was cold against my back, and the air in the hallway was thick with detergent and silence. "Maybe I'm running because of that," I answered, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. He pushed off the doorframe. He took a step. He stopped. He stood halfway down the hallway, at a distance that was too close to be casual and far enough that I had no excuse to back up. The bulb flickered, threw a shadow over the right side of his face, and for a second I saw the scar at his lip in full, no beard to cover it. "I'm not going to trap you in this hallway," he said. "You're between me and the exit. I'm between you and the floor. The back exit is behind you." I turned my head on reflex. He was right. The back door was 3 steps behind me, on the left side, iron bar unlocked. He'd positioned himself in the exact spot where I could leave if I wanted to, and would only stay if I chose to, and I didn't leave. He saw it. He registered it. His eyes came off mine for a fraction of a second, not down to my body, but to my hands, which were open at my sides, neither advancing nor retreating. He took another step, and the distance between us got small enough for me to feel the heat coming off the fabric of his shirt. It wasn't cologne. It was warm skin, starched cloth, and something underneath I couldn't name that made me curl the fingers of my right hand against the seam of my apron. "I don't know what you're doing here," I said, low, and the sentence came out broken because the air wasn't cooperating. "I know," he answered. "I'm doing something very stupid." And he smiled. For the first time since I'd known him, the smile wasn't calculated. It wasn't half a smile. It wasn't the suggestion of a smile. It wasn't the scar twitching in that almost way. It was a whole smile, open, one that climbed up to his eyes and stayed there for 2 seconds before he himself realized what he'd done, and before the smile could vanish, before he could snap back to the control he wore along with his tailored suits. He kissed me. It was fast, barely 2 seconds. His mouth pressed against mine with a firm, brief pressure, and the taste was whiskey, and a held-back urgency that knocked me off balance inside my own body. I felt the cold wall at my back, and the warm mouth at my front, and when he pulled away, my face was red, and I had no words available in any of the languages I spoke. He stepped back half a step. His breathing was a shade heavier than before, and his right hand, which I hadn't seen move, was closed at his side, knuckles white with tension. "I'll wait until you stop running," he said. His voice was low and deep, and there was something in it that wasn't an order. It was a request, and he left, without looking back, without waiting for an answer. He turned his shoulder, crossed the hallway, and disappeared into the floor before I could get my breath back. I stayed there for another 2 minutes, my mouth buzzing, my hand squeezing the apron, my heart beating in the wrong places, in my throat, my wrists, my belly, everywhere it shouldn't have been. The next morning, I couldn't hide it. Miriam was in the kitchen before I was, which was unusual. With the table set for 2 and a pitcher of orange juice she swore was a cure for any kind of nausea. I sat down in the chair with my stomach clenched and my forehead in my hands. The first wave of nausea came before the coffee had a chance to cool. Miriam looked at me over the mug, the black coffee with salt she'd been drinking since her first year of nursing school. Her eye was clinical when it wanted to be. "The nausea's getting worse," she said. It wasn't a question. "A little, Serafina. A little is when you make a face. This is you almost throwing up on the kitchen table. How long has it been like this?" "A few days." She set the mug down, crossed her arms, looked at me the way only Miriam looked at me, with that mix of worry and irritation that meant I was going to hear the truth whether I wanted to or not. "I'm going to ask you something, and you're going to answer me without making up an excuse." She waited for me to lift my face. "What are you going to do when that belly starts showing?" "I don't know. You work at a bar run by the Sicilian Mafia. The boss of that bar sent you a note with the family crest on it. You're pregnant by a man who's no longer in your life, and the money that pays for this table, this orange, and this roof comes from that floor. What exactly about your plan is sustainable, Serafina?" I swallowed hard. She was right, and I hated it when she was right, because Miriam didn't have the slightest bit of care about being right a little at a time. "I'll work as long as I can," I said. "As long as you can is weeks, not months." "I know. And Malakarn, what about him?" "Serafina, he kissed you in a hallway." I opened my mouth and closed it without speaking. Miriam raised an eyebrow and waited. I rested my forehead on the table, because it was the coldest surface in the kitchen. "I'm pregnant by another man, Miriam. Pregnant. And the mafia boss is kissing me in bar hallways. If I told my grandmother this, she would make the sign of the cross and send me off to the nearest convent. See? I already suggested that. I need to eat, Miriam. Convents serve meals." I laughed with my forehead still on the table. Miriam smiled with the mug pressed to her lips, and for a second the apartment felt light, almost livable, almost a place where 2 women in their late 20s could pretend life wasn't falling apart around them. The second passed. The next night, I went back to the Cortile Rosso. Corrado was at the back table, and this time the table was almost empty, just him and Sicilian. Sicilian, on his feet, leaned against the wall beside the door of the hallway that led to the back. Corrado, with an untouched glass in front of him, reading something on his phone with his brow furrowed. I served 2 tables, picked up 3 glasses, avoided the back table, and then Juicy came by with the tray balanced on her shoulder and the message I'd been expecting. "He wants to see you in the office." "The office?" "His office. In the back." I looked toward the back table over Juicy's shoulder. Corrado wasn't there anymore. The chair pulled out, the empty glass, the space occupied by no one. I tucked the cloth into my waistband, took one breath through my nose, and stepped out from behind the counter. The floor felt longer than ever as I crossed the space between the tables to the back hallway. Sicilian pushed off the wall when he saw me coming and fell into step at my side, 2 paces behind, following me down the narrow hallway to a dark wooden door I'd never crossed. He stopped in front of the door, turned his face toward me, and said the only line he spoke in that entire chapter of my life that night. "If he scares you, you yell. I'll hear from out here." I looked at him. His face was serious, his eyes were calm, and there was a genuine kind of protection wrapped up in humor so dry I almost didn't catch it. I nodded. He opened the door, let me through, and stayed on the other side. The office was smaller than I'd imagined. A heavy wooden desk, a bookshelf with books that didn't look like decoration, 2 worn leather armchairs, and a sofa against the side wall. The light was low, coming from a brass lamp with a green shade, and the smell was old paper and strong coffee. Corrado stood with his back to me, pouring 2 glasses on a narrow tray next to the bookshelf. The white shirt without the suit jacket, the sleeves buttoned at the cuffs, the heavy ring catching the amber light of the lamp. He didn't turn around when I came in. "Close the door," he said, without raising his voice. I closed it, pressed my forehead against the wood for a second, breathed, and turned around. "You wanted to see me," I said, folding my arms for lack of a better place for my hands. "I wanted to offer you a coffee." He turned around with the 2 glasses, held one out, "and ask you a few questions. I don't have to answer. I know." He sat in the armchair, the glass balanced on his thigh, and looked at me with that calm I was starting to learn to recognize. "Sit." I sat on the sofa, not in the armchair across from him, because that would have been an interview. On the sofa, where the distance was sideways and the angle was different, and where I could pretend I was just resting in the middle of a shift. The brass lamp threw an amber light between us that made the office feel smaller than it was. He asked me about my family. I lied through half of it, the coffee cooling between my hands. I said I was from Catania, that my grandmother raised me, that my mother lived far away and didn't call often. True. I said I didn't have any siblings. True. I said I'd come to Rome to study nursing. True. He listened to every answer, holding the glass without drinking, and I realized he was storing information the same way he stored whiskey, slowly, without wasting any. "And now?" he asked. "A nurse pouring grappa at a Trastevere bar. What changed?" "Everything," I said, and the word came out heavier than I meant it to. He didn't push. He set the glass on the table next to the armchair and stood up. I felt the air shift before he moved, and when he came closer, I didn't step back. He stopped in front of the sofa, looking down at me, and held out his hand. I took his hand. He pulled me up with a slow motion, no force, and when I was standing in front of him, close enough for the heat of his body to reach my skin through my blouse, he rested his hand on the side of my waist and stayed there. He didn't push. He didn't pull. He waited. I leaned my back against the arm of the sofa. His hand moved up from my waist to the curve of my ribs, and his fingers passed over the fabric of the apron with a slowness that made me close my eyes. His mouth found my neck. Not a kiss, a brush. The tip of his nose tracing the line of my jaw to my ear. I felt my legs give, and I braced against him on instinct, both hands open on his chest, feeling the heat and the hardness of his body through the fabric. His other hand traveled down my leg, over the jeans, slowly, and his thumb traced the inside seam of my thigh, in a motion that pulled a sound out of me I hadn't planned. The leather of the sofa creaked softly as I leaned back against the armrest, and then I felt it, the bulk of the apron against his hip, the double layer of fabric hiding what I needed to hide, pressed between our bodies, so present that I could feel the difference in thickness between my belly and the rest. Cold sweat covered my hands in a second. I froze. "Wait," I said, and my voice came out cracked. "I can't. Not today." He stopped. His hand stayed where it was. His eyes came up to my face. "I'm on my period," I said, and the lie burned my throat because I'm a terrible liar, and Corrado is the last man in the world you should lie to badly. He looked at me for a second longer than he should have. I saw in his eyes that he didn't believe me, but I also saw that he wasn't going to push. His hand came off my leg. He stepped back. He straightened his shirt cuff with a slow, precise motion. "All right," he said, his voice controlled. "Another day." But something in him shifted. I don't know what. I can't put my finger on the word. His jaw locked in a different way as he moved away, and his eyes, which before had looked at me with desire and curiosity, now had a third thing in them I couldn't read. I walked out of the office with my heart in my throat and my hands damp. In the hallway, Sicilian wasn't there anymore. In his place, sitting in an armchair against the wall, legs crossed and jacket buttoned up to the second button, was a man I hadn't seen come into the bar, but who walked into every place without anyone noticing. Ettore Brancaleone, the Don's father's consigliere, the Palermo veteran who must have come in through the back while I was locked in that office. He didn't say a word. He didn't move. He just followed my face with his eyes as I passed, with the calm of a man putting together a puzzle in no hurry, and I felt the weight of that look on my back, until I turned the corner of the hallway and disappeared into the floor. I didn't know, and there was no way to know that night, that before dawn, Ettore would knock on the door of Corrado's office and say, in the voice of a man who doesn't repeat himself, "The girl is not what she seems. Be careful." Chapter 4. A Two-Handed Trap. What I'm about to tell now, I didn't see myself. I was asleep in my apartment in Testaccio when it happened, with my hand on my belly and my face buried in the pillow, because the nausea was easier when I slept on my stomach, even though every pregnancy guide out there said the opposite. Corrado told me later, in a voice that didn't try to sweeten any of it, and I believed every single detail, because that was how he talked, when he had no intention of shielding me from the truth. The morning after what happened in the office, Ettore Brancaleone showed up early at the Malacarne villa. The villa was on the Via Appia Antica, outside the city, on an old property hemmed in by tall pines that hid the wall from the road. On the south side there was a lemon grove planted by Corrado's grandmother, and the house itself was pale stone, with tall windows looking out onto a lawn nobody crossed without permission. Corrado had lived there alone since he'd taken over the family, except for his mother, who had her own wing and left for mass before anyone else was awake. Ettore found Corrado in the second-floor study, standing by the window, a coffee in his hand and the same clothes from the night before. He hadn't slept. Ettore sat in the chair across from the desk without being invited, because men with 61 years of service don't ask permission, and said, with the economy of words that made him feared, "The waitress. She understands everything, and someone's paying her for it." Corrado didn't answer. He stayed facing the window, coffee still in his hand. "Beppe Teresi," Ettore went on. "He's paid her rent 4 times over the past few months, and it wasn't charity." Beppe Teresi, the name I carried around in my own head with the taste of dirty coin on my tongue. Ettore wasn't wrong. Teresi paid my rent, and I paid his back with information. Who came into the Cortile Rosso, who left, how much they drank, who they talked to. It was blackmail of the simplest kind, from a simple man. He'd found me by chance, figured out where I worked and what I could hear, and offered me a deal that wasn't a deal. It was a threat with a receipt. Former lieutenant to the Malacarne family, kicked out for stealing money that wasn't his, surviving on petty scams and on my obedience. I hated every cent he deposited, but the cents covered part of the rent, never the whole thing, never on time, never without me having to top up the rest with tips and extra shifts. The prenatal appointments, the bills, the box of diapers I'd started hiding in the hallway closet, all of that came out of my own sweat, not his money. And I had no choice, because Teresi knew enough to destroy me, and I had no one to protect me, or so I thought. Corrado, as he told me later, listened to everything Ettore said without moving a muscle. When the old man was done, he walked to the desk, set the coffee on a pile of papers, and asked in a flat voice, "How long has she been working for him?" "Months," Ettore said, "and it doesn't look like it's by choice." Corrado was quiet. Ettore waited. And then Corrado said something Ettore wasn't expecting. "Don't do anything. Don, nothing. I'll handle it." Ettore stood up, straightened the scarf inside his jacket, and walked out of the study without arguing, because men with 61 years of service also know when to keep their mouths shut. Days later, Corrado went down to the Tiber. I didn't see this either, but I know, because he told me with the same tone and the same absence of remorse, that he had Sicilian call Teresi and set a meeting near a bridge on the south bank of the river. The armored car parked 30 meters off. Corrado didn't get out. Sicilian stepped out on the passenger side, walked up to Teresi, who was waiting leaning on the iron railing with his short beard and the eyes of a man who hadn't slept well, and handed him a brown envelope. Teresi opened it, went pale, tucked it into the pocket of his coat. Sicilian walked back to the car without saying a word. The engine turned over. The car drove off. What was in the envelope? I never knew for sure. False information, probably. Switched names, altered dates, transactions that didn't exist. Corrado's plan was simple in its structure, and cruel in its execution. Feed Teresi data that was worth nothing, keep the blackmail alive so Teresi would think he was still in control, and let me go on working at the Cortile Rosso, without realizing that both ends of the leash around my neck now belonged to the same man. I still didn't know, but I was already bait. The night Corrado came back to the bar after those days was different from all the others. I noticed it in the temperature, not the air's. That was the same heavy, dry Roman autumn. His, something in his posture, in the way he pulled out the chair, in the way his shoulders sat loose inside the jacket, a lightness that didn't match the man I'd come to associate with tense hallways and clipped sentences. He ordered his usual whiskey. I poured it. His fingers brushed mine when he took the glass, and this time his hand didn't pull back or linger. It just stayed there for a fraction of a second before he brought the glass to his mouth. He drank slowly, his eyes on the floor of the bar, and asked me with a disarming ease, "Have you eaten?" "I eat after my shift," I answered, caught off guard. "Eat what?" "Whatever's around." "That's not an answer. It's the one I've got, Signor Malacarne." He looked at me with the corner of his mouth crooked up, in something that was almost humor. Almost. Corrado, he said. I've already kissed you in a hallway. I think you can use my first name. I opened my mouth to answer and closed it without saying anything, because the heat climbed up my neck to my ears, and I didn't trust my voice to come out in one piece. He noticed. He didn't comment. He went back to drinking the whiskey, and the line of his shoulders relaxed another inch. He knew. He already knew everything. And there, at that table, with the glass in his hand and the question about dinner, he was pretending nothing had changed, because the plan needed me to keep serving, keep listening, and keep reporting to Teresi, as if the world were still the same. I didn't catch it that night. I only caught it later, when the penny dropped along with Teresi's body on the floor of a parking lot. Halfway through my shift, Sicilian appeared behind the counter. I was drying glasses, the damp cloth wrapped around my hand, when his shadow blocked the light of the nearest fixture. He stopped next to me, standing, his hands in the pockets of his coat, his expression the usual one, the expression of a man who doesn't have expressions. "Can I get you something to drink?" I asked, more reflex than offer. "I work for your boyfriend," he said, without moving a muscle of his face. "I can't drink." I choked on the air. "He's not my—" I started, and the sentence died on its own in the middle because I didn't know how to finish it. Sicilian smiled, mouth closed, no teeth, with the economy of a man who rations his own humor by the drop, and he walked off, without adding anything else, because Sicilian was the kind of man who dropped the grenade on the floor and walked in the opposite direction without turning to see the blast. I stood there behind the counter with the wet glass in my hand and my face red, and Juicy, who had heard the whole thing from the other side, looked at me with her eyebrow raised and her mouth pressed tight so she wouldn't laugh. "Don't," I said. I didn't say anything. "Don't." I wasn't going to. Juicy, okay. The rest of the night passed without any bigger incidents. Corrado talked with 2 men I didn't know, signed something Sicilian brought over in an envelope, and drank 2 glasses in 3 hours, which was little for him and something I shouldn't have known. But I knew, because 3 years behind a bar had taught me to measure every customer's consumption without needing to look at the bottle. When the shift ended and I walked out the back door with my backpack on my shoulder and the tiredness in my bones, the black car was parked in the alley. Not the car I'd seen on the corner of my building. This one I recognized by the driver, who was Sicilian. The back door opened. Corrado appeared in the gap, his jacket on his lap and his tie loosened. "Get in," he said. "I'll take you home. I can take a taxi." "You can, but you won't." It wasn't a threat. It was certainty. His certainty carried that unbearable weight of a man who already knows the answer before asking the question. I looked at Sicilian in the front seat, who was looking out at the street with the interest of a man counting lampposts, and I got into the car. The back seat was cold leather, and the inside smelled of coffee, and the cologne I already knew from the night of the office. Corrado didn't sit close. He stayed on the other side, his arm resting on the window, and his face turned toward the street, and he didn't say a word the whole way. Trastevere, Tiber, Testaccio. The car cut through the city in silence, and I stayed watching the streetlights pass by the window, feeling his presence on the other side of the seat without needing to confirm it. When Sicilian pulled up in front of my building, Corrado turned to me for the first time. "Good night, Serafina." "Good night," I answered, my hand already on the door handle. "Eat something before you go to sleep." I opened the door. I got out. I didn't look back. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs with the key in my hand, and my chest squeezed by something I didn't want to name. Miriam was in her room, the light off, the heavy breathing of a woman already asleep. I turned on the lamp in the living room, went to the window and looked down. The car was parked there, engine running, lights off. He was waiting for me to turn the light on so he'd know I was home, safe, on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in a building with cracked tile work. The same thing the black car had done that afternoon at the market. I stood at the window until the car drove off. It took 20 seconds. 20 seconds in which I saw, through the tinted window of the back seat, the silhouette of him looking up. The car disappeared around the curve of the street. I closed the curtain, and in the hallway, taking off the apron, I realized it. The second layer of fabric, the one I tied with a double knot over the first, was getting tight. Not at the bow, the fabric itself. The belly I'd been hiding for weeks was pushing against the seam, and when I tied the knot that night, I had to pull 1 extra loop compared to the week before. I leaned against the hallway wall, the apron hanging from my hand, and I thought, with the cruel clarity that only shows up at the end of the day, when the body stops and the mind doesn't, in a week, maybe 2, The belly was going to show. It didn't matter how many layers I wore, how many aprons I stacked, how many loose jeans I bought. The body was doing what the body does, and I had no way to negotiate with it. I needed to get out of that bar. But what I didn't know yet, and wouldn't find out until it was too late, was that getting out wasn't up to me anymore. Chapter 5. The Bullet and the Question. The Cortile Rosso was packed that night, more than usual, and I felt the tiredness in every lap I took between tables. It wasn't the usual tiredness. It was a new weight, distributed in a way I didn't control, a slowness that came from inside and forced me to breathe deeper between one tray and the next. The past few weeks had collected their price. My body was changing at its own pace without consulting me, and I walked the floor feeling like I was sharing the space with someone who didn't have a face yet. Juicy was working the opposite side of the counter, covering the tables near the entrance with the silent efficiency of a woman who'd made that round 1,000 times. I had the back, including the table that was now mine by decree, though that night it was occupied by men I didn't know. Corrado wasn't there. When I asked about Cillian, because his absence rearranged the floor in a way I only noticed when he wasn't around, Juicy shrugged and said he'd gone to take care of something in Ostia. I accepted it without thinking. There was no reason to question a message passed along over the clatter of glasses. Close to midnight, the owner called me to the counter. "Serafina, go down to the garage and bring up the case of grappa I left in the storeroom this morning. Juicy's alone on the floor. I need you back fast." I hesitated with the cloth in my hand. The garage at that hour was empty. I knew because I'd gone down there other times and had never liked the silence down below. But the owner had already turned his back. The floor was full, and Juicy couldn't cover both halves on her own. I dropped the cloth on the edge of the sink and walked toward the ramp that led down to the underground garage. The ramp was long, with a slope that made my knee complain, and the fluorescent light overhead flickered at an irregular interval that hurt my eyes. The air down there was different from the floor above, cold, damp, smelling of concrete, motor oil, and something metallic that stuck to the back of my throat. The parked cars cast long shadows under the lamps, and the silence was the kind of silence that makes a person hear her own breathing too loud. I walked slowly, one hand on the railing and the double apron tugging at my waist. My steps echoed on the concrete floor and came back to me on a delay that felt deliberate. The storeroom was at the far end, behind a metal door painted gray, and I could already see the handle when the movement showed up at the edge of my vision. Beppe Teresi stepped out from behind 2 parked cars, and for the first time I saw that face up close. It was a face too lived in for its age. The short, badly shaved beard grew in uneven tufts over a skin marked by sun and bad nights. His eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles so deep they looked tattooed on, and his mouth was pressed into a thin line I recognized. It was the mouth of a man who'd been chewing on his own rage for too long and was about to spit it on someone. He moved fast, faster than I expected for a man his size. Before I could step back, before my body could even register the danger and tell my legs to move, he shoved me against the concrete pillar, and his left hand closed around my throat. The impact knocked the air out of me. The back of my head hit the concrete, and I saw white sparks at the edges of my vision, spots of light that flashed and disappeared while the pain spread through the base of my skull. His hand was big, fingers splayed wide, and his thumb pressed sideways against my windpipe, cutting off the air without crushing it. It wasn't meant to kill fast. It was meant to hold me in place. His face came close enough for me to catch his breath. Cheap cigarettes, reheated coffee, an acidity that turned my stomach more than the hand on my throat. "You used me," he said, voice low and thick, each word shoved out between his teeth. "You and him. Both of you used me." I tried to deny it. I opened my mouth, and what came out was a choked sound, formless, a piece of a vowel that died before it could become a word. His fingers squeezed harder. The pressure on my neck rose, and my field of vision narrowed, the edges darkening, while the center became absurdly sharp. I could see every pore on his face, every hair of the badly shaved beard, every red vein in his eyes. "Cattle run between 2 sides," he growled, his mouth centimeters from mine. "You know what that is? You." And inside the lack of air, with the cruel clarity the body finds when it's close to its limit, I understood. Corrado knew. He'd known about the blackmail. He'd known about Teresi. He'd known about the Sicilian. He'd known all of it. The gentle approach of the past few weeks, the car that took me home, the question about dinner, the brush of his fingers when I served the glass, the line about using his first name. All of it was bait. All of it was a trap. He had set up the board with the patience of a man playing alone, moved every piece into the right spot, and I was the piece at the center because I was the one Teresi would come for. The hand squeezed harder. I felt my legs give, my knees fold, and the thought came through strangely lucid, in the way the body finds when almost nothing is left, a straight line of consciousness cutting through the fog. If I pass out, he kills the baby with me. The instinctive hand that protects the belly never got a chance to rise. The shot got there first. Short, clean, no echo. A dry sound that cut through the air of the garage, hit the concrete of the walls, and was gone before I had time to close my eyes. Teresi let go of my throat. His eyes stayed open for a second, without expression, without surprise, without anything, and then his body tipped to the side. His shoulder hit the hood of the nearest car, and he slid to the floor with the heavy slowness of things that don't come back. Corrado was 3 meters away, the gun up, his arm steady, his face wearing no expression at all. Behind him, coming out of the dark end of the garage with the calm of a man showing up to an appointment, Sicilian appeared. The thing in Ostia was this. They had both known Teresi would come that night, because Corrado had planted the right information in the right place and waited for the rage to do the work of bringing the target to the trap. I dropped to my knees, not from fear, from rage. The rage rose up from the bottom of my stomach and burned through the throat Teresi had just released. I was on my knees on the dirty concrete floor, my hand at my neck, and the taste of blood in my mouth from biting my own tongue, and I looked at Corrado with everything I had inside me in that moment: fury, betrayal, relief, and disgust, mixed into one thing I didn't know how to name, burning inside me with an intensity that made me shake. Sicilian helped me to my feet. His hand was firm and impersonal, a professional doing his job. No extra kindness and no coldness either, just the pressure needed to get me upright. Corrado holstered the gun under his jacket, looked down at his own cuff, where there was a spatter of blood, from Teresi, who had fallen leaning against him, and said in the voice that didn't ask, "Get in the car." I got in, not because I wanted to, because there was no place in the world to go with a marked throat, the taste of blood in my mouth, and a belly full of a life that depended on me staying on my feet. The back seat of the armored car was dark, cold leather, and the engine was already running when Sicilian got in the front and pulled up to the exit ramp. Corrado got in the other side and closed the door without hurry. The car pulled out of the garage, turned onto the main street, and started climbing toward the Via Appia Antica. I fell apart. I screamed all of it, that he'd known about the blackmail and hadn't told me, that he'd used me for weeks as bait, as a piece in a game I hadn't asked to play, that he'd planted false information on Teresi knowing the man would come after me, that he was a monster, that he was just like every other man I'd ever seen at that back table, that I hated him, that he had no right to kiss me in hallways and ask if I'd eaten dinner while he was setting up an execution around me. I screamed until my voice cracked, until my breath ran out, until the car went silent, because I had no more air left to keep the fury on its feet. Corrado listened to all of it without moving. His bloodied cuff rested on his thigh, and he was cleaning it with a white handkerchief, slowly, fold by fold, with the attention of a man taking care of a small detail while the world burns down around him. He didn't defend himself. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to explain. When I stopped, gasping, my face wet and my hands shaking in my lap, he folded the handkerchief one last time, tucked it into the pocket of his jacket, and turned. His voice came out different, lower, rougher, a voice I'd never heard from him before. No control, no sharpened courtesy, nothing between what he felt and what he said. How many weeks? The whole car went cold. I looked at him. I looked at the hand resting on his thigh, so calm it seemed to belong to a different man. I looked at his eyes, which weren't accusing or angry. They were waiting, and I understood, my stomach dropping, that he knew this too. He had known for a while, since the double apron, since the tray carried on my hip, since the night in the office when I froze and made up a lie he didn't buy. I really fell apart then, not the rage kind, the other kind, the one that comes when there's no wall left to hold up. I told him everything. Gaetano Risotto, the boyfriend I'd had for 3 years, engineer, quiet, big hands, an easy laugh, a way of looking at me when I talked that made me feel like my words had weight. His mother, Elenia, had died of illness the year before, and he never talked about her without his voice changing, killed in a car accident on the Via Salaria, weeks ago, on a dry curve, on a night with no rain. The car rolled over, and I got the call from the hospital when there was nothing left to receive. I told him I'd found out about the pregnancy a week after the funeral, sitting on the bathroom floor, a towel around my shoulders, and the test in my hand, that I had no family in Rome, that my mother had called once after the funeral and never called again, that the Cortile Rosso paid for the crib, the prenatal visits, the pack of diapers I'd hidden in the hallway closet, because stashing diapers was the only way I'd found to believe that this child was real and would actually get here. Corrado didn't interrupt. He didn't move his hands. He didn't look away. When I was done, my voice destroyed and my palms open in my lap, he wiped the cuff one last time, more out of reflex than need, and looked at me with dark, very still eyes. "From now on," he said, and his voice carried a weight that wasn't a threat. It was an oath. "You and that child are mine. Nobody touches either of you." I didn't know if that sentence was a promise or a sentence. I didn't know if the heat rising in my chest was relief or fear. I stayed there watching his profile cut by the light of the street lamp sweeping past the window, and I thought, with the exhaustion of someone who'd already burned through all the rage in her body, that maybe promise and sentence were the same thing when they came from a man like that. The car turned in through the villa gate and stopped on the gravel driveway. When the door opened, a woman with white hair, tall and with a hard gaze, was waiting at the top of the front steps. Her posture was straight, her arms at her sides, and the porch light lit a face that looked like it had been beautiful for a whole lifetime and now wore severity in place of vanity. Adelaide Malacarne, his mother. Corrado got out of the car, held out his hand, and helped me down without hurry. I felt the gravel under my soles and the night air on my face, and for a second, the world felt absurdly large after the inside of that car. Adelaide didn't move. Her eyes dropped from her son's face to mine, then to my belly, then back to her son, in a reading that took 2 seconds and said everything it needed to say. "Not now, Mama," Corrado said, walking past her with my hand still in his. Adelaide didn't answer. She stayed on the steps with her spine straight and her mouth closed, and I kept the face of that woman in my memory without knowing why. Maybe because her look, cold and measured, reminded me that the man who had just sworn to protect me had been raised by someone who didn't forgive easily. Chapter 6. The Lemon Grove. The Lemon Grove Corrado took me to a guest room on the 2nd floor. We climbed the main staircase in silence, crossed a wide hallway lined with paintings I didn't have the energy to look at, and he stopped in front of a dark wooden door, opened it, and turned on the inside light with a short gesture. The room was big, a wide bed with white sheets, a dresser, an armchair by the window, and a bathroom with the door slightly ajar. It smelled like lavender and old house, and the window looked out onto the garden I didn't know yet. Corrado stayed in the doorway. He didn't come in. His shoulder leaned against the doorframe. His hands dropped into the pockets of his trousers, and he looked at me with a tiredness that matched mine. "Rest," he said. "Nobody touches you here." And he closed the door from the outside. I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the too-big bed, my shoes still on and my hand on my belly, and I tried to organize what I knew. He saved my life. He also used me for weeks without telling me. He killed a man in front of me, wiped the blood off with a handkerchief, and asked me how many weeks pregnant I was with the same calm he'd used to ask if I'd eaten. I didn't know where the relief ended and the rage began, and the two of them spun together inside me until I lost track of which was which. I took off my shoes. I lay on my side. I pressed my forehead into the pillow and watched the dark window, listening to the sounds of the villa I didn't know yet, the wind in the pines, a distant dog, the creak of old wood settling. My neck hurt. The mark of Terese's fingers was hot and swollen, and when I pressed my fingers there, the pain came along with the memory of air that wouldn't come in and the thought that came after, the baby. I ran my hand slowly over my belly, feeling the curve that was already there and that the apron wasn't going to cover for much longer, and I said quietly, to no one, "We're okay." I don't know what time I closed my eyes. I know that when I opened them, the light had already changed. In the morning, I came downstairs. The main staircase was stone, with a worked iron railing worn smooth at the spots where generations of hands had gripped it. The kitchen was on the ground floor, on the east side, big, quiet, with a pale tile floor and a long marble counter where someone had left a tray with bread, figs, and a pitcher of water. A housekeeper in a dark blue apron was wiping down the stove and looked up when I came in. "Signora Adelaide has gone out to Mass," she said, before I could ask. "Signor Corrado is in the garden." I ate. Bread and figs, because my stomach asked for exactly that, and the hunger was so simple and so urgent that I obeyed without thinking. I drank the glass of water leaning against the cold counter, trying to look like a whole person. Corrado appeared in the kitchen doorway. No jacket. white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, the top button undone, the dark circles dug deep beneath his dark eyes. He hadn't slept. I could see it in his face, in the way his jaw carried a tension the rest of his body was trying to hide. He looked at me, looked at the empty plate, and the corner of his mouth moved into something that didn't quite make it to a smile. "Come with me," he said. I followed him. The lemon grove was on the south side of the villa, set off by a low stone wall that separated the trees from the rest of the property. The rows of lemon trees had been planted by his grandmother, as the housekeeper told me later, and nobody had ever dared to change the arrangement. The scent was strong, citrus, alive, such a brutal contrast to the garage from the night before that my body registered it before my mind, and I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in hours. The morning light filtered through the leaves with a golden insistence that made that patch of ground feel separate from the rest of Rome. There was a stone bench between two trees, worn by time, its surface smoothed by years of use. We sat, him on one side, me on the other, with a hand's width between us that was too wide to be casual and too narrow to be safe. He told me everything. Since when he'd known I understood Sicilian, since the night of the pickup line, when the look I sent back had been too sharp for a woman who hadn't caught every syllable, since when he'd known about Teresi, since the morning Ettore sat in the chair across from his desk and said what he said. He walked me through the logic of the trap without trying to sweeten it, without asking for forgiveness, without pretending he'd done it for me. He'd done it for the family. Teresi was a threat that had to be cut off, and the cleanest way was to let him expose himself on his own. The false information in the envelope, the rent that kept being paid, the nights I'd worked serving tables and reporting back data that was worth nothing, all of it calculated. Teresi had tried to sell the data to a contact in Naples, and when the names didn't match and the dates didn't exist, the contact cut ties, and Teresi realized he'd been poisoned by his own source. His rage wasn't about having lost. It was about finding out he'd never been in the game to begin with. "And the owner of the bar?" I asked, because the question had been stuck in my throat since the night before. "He sent me down to the garage alone. Was that you too?" Corrado didn't look away. "I needed Teresi to find you in a closed space. He wasn't going to approach you on a crowded floor." The owner got the instruction without knowing why. The answer hit me in the stomach, but I was already bracing for the hurt. What surprised me was that he didn't try to hide it. "And when did this stop being only about the family?" I asked, because I needed to hear it. He was quiet for a while. He pulled a leaf off the nearest lemon tree, spun it between his fingers, and let it drop to the ground before answering. "I don't know. I wish it was clean. I wish I could say I kept the two things separate, but I can't point to the day I stopped watching you for the table and started watching you for myself." "And the pregnancy?" I asked, my voice lower. "When did you know?" "For a while now," he answered, looking at the lemons in front of him and not at me. "The way you carried the tray changed. You balanced the weight on your hip instead of on your arms. You shielded your belly with your elbow every time someone walked past fast. And on the night in the office, when you froze, it wasn't fear of me. It was fear I'd feel it." I swallowed hard. He was right. And the fact that he was right was the most terrifying and the most comforting thing I'd felt in weeks. We were quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the lemon trees and the citrus scent grew stronger, and I looked at my hands in my lap, and at his hands resting on his knee, and I realized the rage was still there, but it had changed shape. It wasn't fury anymore. It was hurt, and hurt I could carry without screaming. "What happens to me now?" I asked. "You stay here as long as you want. You leave when you want. Nobody forces you into anything." He turned to me for the first time, and his eyes were tired in a way I'd never seen. Without the armor, without the calculation, without anything between him and me. "But I need you to know one thing. I'm not letting you walk out of this gate alone while the Malakarn name can be used against you. And it can." I understood that this was a gilded cage, but I also understood that, on the other side, the baby and I would be in a cage with no gate and no one to stand watch. I chose to stay. In the afternoon, the garden was quiet. The light had shifted, lower, warmer, and we were still there, on the same bench, closer than before. He had told me about his father, the murder inside the villa, the body he'd found himself, the mistrust it had planted in him from that day on. I had told him about my grandmother, the Sicilian I'd learned in her Catania kitchen, the sayings she used to repeat. The way she taught me that language is a weapon that hides better than a knife. We traded pieces of a past we weren't obligated to trade, and every piece we gave was a piece of wall coming down. He kissed me there, among the lemons. It wasn't like in the hallway, fast and stolen. It was slow, with a gentleness I hadn't known lived inside that body. His hand held my face with care, his thumb along my jawline, and when his mouth found mine, I tasted coffee and a decision that had already been made by the two of us, without either of us needing to say it out loud. We went up together, by the side staircase, in silence, his steps on the stone, mine right behind, and between us, the weight of everything we already knew and everything we hadn't done yet. He opened the door to his suite, and looked at me for a second before he touched me. I nodded. He closed the door slowly. He kissed my forehead first, then my mouth. His hands moved carefully down my waist, and in his fingers I felt the awareness of the weight I was carrying. He knew why my waist was thick, and the care with which he touched it made my eyes burn. He whispered in Sicilian, his mouth against my ear, that I was too beautiful to be real. I answered, in the same language, that he was telling a pretty lie, and he laughed under his breath, a short laugh that vibrated against my skin, and that I kept inside me as proof that this man was capable of laughing. He undressed me slowly, piece by piece, with an attention that wasn't rushed. It was steady. When his fingers passed over the curve of my belly, his open palm lingered there a second longer, and his thumb traced the stretched skin with a lightness that made me hold my breath. He looked me in the eyes, and I saw something there that wasn't desire. It was reverence, an intensity that scared me more than any word he'd ever said to me. "Ours," he whispered, his hand still on my belly, and the word on his mouth sounded not like a promise of the future, but like a fact he'd already decided on, and that the rest of the world would learn to accept. He took me to the bed. He laid me down with a care that contrasted with everything I'd ever seen from him, and he positioned himself at my side, propped up on his elbow, his whole body turned to me, his eyes traveling over my face before moving down. His mouth found my neck, my collarbone, the space between my breasts, and every spot he touched was left burning. I gripped the sheet with both hands when his mouth moved lower, and I heard myself saying things I hadn't planned, broken syllables that came out in Italian and in Sicilian and in no language at all, because my body had taken the place of reason, and reason didn't complain. When he came back and positioned himself between my legs, bracing his weight on his arms to keep from pressing on my belly, I opened my eyes and found him looking down at me with an expression I'd never seen in him. Vulnerability, raw, open, without the armor he wore at every table and in every hallway and in every armored car of his life. And it was that expression, more than any touch, that made me let go of the sheet and pull his face down to mine. He pushed into me slowly, with a measured depth that arched my back and made me close my eyes. I felt every inch, every slow, deep stroke, pulling almost all the way back before returning, with a patience that was torture and was care at the same time. He was watching me, his eyes fixed on my face, attentive to every reaction, and the pressure of his hands on my hips was firm and steady, an anchor I hadn't known I needed. "Look at me," he said, his voice hoarse, and I opened my eyes. The rhythm picked up. Without losing the depth, without losing the attention, he sped up until every stroke pulled a sound out of me I couldn't hold back. The room filled with the breathing of both of us, with the low sounds that escaped him against my mouth, with the rhythmic meeting of bodies. I felt the tension climb to a point past the turn, and when I broke, my whole body contracting in spasms that held him inside me, he let out a low sound against my neck and gave in at the same moment, his body going taut in one last deep movement before he let go of everything he had been holding. We stayed there, breath coming back slowly, bodies still joined, sweat cooling on our skin. He didn't pull away. He stayed heavy and close, his forehead on my shoulder, and his hand drifted down to my belly and stayed there, open, warm, covering what was his by choice and not by blood. I put my hand over his hand. I closed my eyes. His voice came low and unhurried, with a humor I hadn't expected, and that, for that reason, landed dead center. "You're going to have to learn formal Italian. My mother doesn't speak dialect in public." I laughed. A laugh that came out wet, that caught me off guard, that rose up from the same place that hours before had only had rage coming out of it. It was humor in the most vulnerable moment, exactly in the fracture where laughter shouldn't fit, and that was why it fit there more than anywhere else. He pulled the sheet over the two of us. His hand stayed over my hand, which stayed over my belly, and I let myself stay, because fighting that warmth would have been fighting the only good thing that had happened to me in months. I fit my body into his, felt his arm wrap around me on reflex, even in sleep, and I closed my eyes, and I slept, all the way, no dreams, for the first time in weeks, a pity that this would be the last time. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. 3 months sleeping beside him, finally at peace. 3 months believing that after everything, real life had begun. A silent apartment, her belly growing, and a man who had taken her in even with another man's child in her womb. Serafina began to believe she was saved. Until the afternoon she opened the wrong drawer in his office. Inside the envelope bearing Gaetano's name, there were 3 photos, a receipt signed in black ink, and a single word scrawled with violence, Frenny. The date was from 3 days before the accident. The signature was Corrado's. Serafina stood frozen, the paper trembling between her fingers, as the truth tore apart everything she had tried to rebuild. 7 months of life were growing inside her. Then the question surfaced, cruel, inevitable, impossible to contain, and Serafina wasn't prepared for the answer. The man who stroked her belly every night, was he the same man who had ordered the murder of her child's father? Like I said, that was just a taste of book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side. Unfortunately, many people have been downloading our audio, effectively copying the entire story, and simply reposting it on YouTube. If you want to watch the original story and be the first to receive the next ones, search for My Stories by Lena on YouTube to get the best dark romance content. Remember, the official channel is My Stories by Lena on YouTube. I'll be waiting for you there.